There's a town, deep inside the Arctic Circle, where you are not allowed to die. That's the story you'll find if you search for it. Headlines calling it the town where death is illegal. Videos claiming there's an actual law against it. Here's the twist. That's not true. There's no law. Nobody gets arrested for dying. But the real reason this town treats death differently is stranger and considerably more unsettling than the myth. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why one of the coldest places on Earth had to make a decision that most of the world has never had to think about. The town is called Longyearbyen. It sits on the Svalbard archipelago, roughly halfway between mainland Norway and the North Pole. It's the northernmost settlement of its size on the planet, and the ground here does something most ground doesn't do. It never fully thaws. This is permafrost, soil that stays frozen year-round, sometimes hundreds of meters deep. It's less like dirt and more like packed concrete locked in place by ice that hasn't melted in centuries. For most of human history, when someone died, you buried them, and nature took its course. Bacteria break the body down. Within years, sometimes less, very little remains. But bacteria need one thing to do that job: a temperature warm enough to stay active, and permafrost never gets there. In 1918, the Spanish flu reached even this remote outpost. 11 residents died and were buried in the town's small graveyard, the same way anyone would have been buried anywhere else in the world at the time. Nobody thought much more about it for decades. Then, in 1950, something happened that made the town rethink its entire relationship with its own cemetery. Workers and researchers examining the graveyard noticed something that shouldn't have been possible after 30 years underground. The bodies hadn't decomposed, not partially, barely at all. The permafrost hadn't just failed to break them down. It had done the opposite. It had preserved them, almost exactly as they were the day they were buried. Which raises an obvious question. If the bodies were frozen solid and untouched by time, what happened to whatever killed them? This is where the story stops being simply eerie and starts becoming genuinely dangerous. The 11 people buried after the 1918 flu pandemic hadn't just been preserved themselves. There was growing concern that the virus that killed them might have been preserved right along with them. Local authorities made a decision. The cemetery would stop accepting new burials. Not because of a law against dying, there isn't one, there never was, but because burying anyone else in ground that could act as permanent cold storage for deadly pathogens was simply too big a risk to keep taking. That decision held for decades, based on caution and a working theory. Nobody actually knew for certain the virus was still viable, until scientists decided to find out. In the 1990s, a team of researchers received permission to exhume some of the 1918 victims, specifically to test whether the frozen tissue still contained the virus that killed them more than 70 years earlier. They found their answer. Preserved lung tissue from at least one victim still contained identifiable traces of the 1918 influenza strain, one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, a virus that killed somewhere between 1 and 6% of the entire global population. Frozen, waiting, exactly where it had been left in 1918. This wasn't just a horror story, though. It became one of the most valuable discoveries in the study of pandemics. Researchers used genetic material recovered from these permafrost-preserved remains to help reconstruct parts of the 1918 virus's genome, information that's since become part of how scientists understand and prepare for future flu pandemics. In other words, the same freezing ground that made this town terrifying also turned it into an accidental time capsule for modern medicine. So what does this actually mean for someone living in Longyearbyen today? If you're seriously injured or diagnosed with a terminal illness, you're not treated there long-term. The town's hospital is built for the everyday needs of a small Arctic community, not for advanced or end-of-life care. Residents who are gravely ill are typically flown to mainland Norway, where full medical facilities exist. It isn't a legal requirement. There's no officer waiting to deport you for the crime of dying on the wrong side of a map. It's simply that the infrastructure to properly care for you at the end of life doesn't exist there, and the ground beneath the town can't safely take you afterward either. Which means, unofficially, most people never actually die in Longyearbyen at all. Not because they're not allowed to, because almost everyone who's close to death has already left. Cremation is technically permitted, though rarely chosen. Even then, burying the ashes requires special government permission. The permafrost concern doesn't fully disappear just because a body has been reduced to ash, and space in this Arctic community is already limited. And death isn't the only major life event this town quietly exports elsewhere. Longyearbyen's hospital also isn't equipped for complicated childbirth, so pregnant residents typically travel to mainland Norway weeks before their due date, just to be safe. It's a strange, almost poetic symmetry, a town that can't fully host either end of a human life, arranging for both its arrivals and its departures to happen somewhere else. The town has a handful of other rules shaped by the same harsh environment. Cats are banned to protect the Arctic bird populations that nest here. Carrying a firearm outside town limits isn't unusual. It's genuinely necessary, given the local polar bear population outnumbers permanent human residents on the archipelago. This is a place where the rules aren't bureaucratic red tape. Almost every one of them exists because the Arctic itself doesn't forgive carelessness. Here's where the story gets stranger still, and where the climate crisis adds an entirely new layer to a decades-old decision. Svalbard is warming roughly 4 times faster than the global average. That frozen ground, the same ground that's kept 1918's influenza locked in place for over a century, is not guaranteed to stay frozen forever. Which means a decision made in 1950, out of local caution, has quietly become something with global stakes. Researchers studying permafrost regions elsewhere in the Arctic have already documented ancient pathogens becoming viable again as the ground around them destabilizes and thaws. In 2016, a heat wave in Siberia thawed ground deeply enough to expose the decades-old carcass of a reindeer that had died of anthrax. The bacteria, dormant in the permafrost for an estimated 75 years, infected local reindeer herds and eventually people, killing a child and hospitalizing dozens more. It was a real, documented case of exactly the danger Longyearby's cemetery has been quietly managing since 1950. Proof that preserved doesn't mean harmless, it just means waiting. Longyearby's cemetery is a small, contained example of a much larger question scientists are actively tracking. What else has the cold been holding on to, and what happens if it lets go? And this pattern isn't even unique to Longyearbyen. Historically speaking, the idea of a place where death itself is treated as something to be managed, avoided, or exported elsewhere isn't new. Ancient Greeks considered the island of Delos so sacred that neither death nor birth was permitted to occur on it. Anyone close to either was ferried to a neighboring island first, and the entire population of existing graves was once forcibly relocated off the island in a religious purification ritual. Longyearbyen's version of this isn't about religious purity. It's about biology, timing, and a virus that refuses to expire on schedule. It's also worth remembering this wasn't always a town built around this problem. Longyearbyen was founded in 1906 as a coal mining settlement, named after the American businessman who established the operation. For decades, it was simply a remote industrial outpost, drawing workers willing to endure some of the harshest conditions on Earth for steady mining wages. Nobody founding a coal town in 1906 was thinking about permafrost virology. The cemetery problem wasn't a founding principle, it was something the town backed into, one exhumed body at a time. Which brings us back to that headline you've probably seen: "It's illegal to die here." It's not the law that makes this place strange. It's not a courtroom, or a fine, or a prison sentence waiting for anyone reckless enough to pass away in the wrong postcode. No officer has ever knocked on a door in Longyearbyen to enforce a law that was never actually written. It's that the ground itself refuses to let go. Every body it's ever kept is still down there, unchanged, patiently outlasting the century that buried it. Most places on Earth, death fades quietly into the landscape. The evidence breaks down, disappears, becomes part of the soil again within a lifetime or two. In Longyearbyen, nothing fades. The town isn't defying death. It's just living directly on top of the one place on the planet where death forgot how to finish the job.